Erev Tov and welcome everyone. We are continuing in our series talking about kashrut in the modern world. And in fact, tonight I'm very excited about because the topic tonight, lab-grown meat, which I'll define in a moment, is so cutting edge that unlike other areas of kashrut, where there might be some debate about it because there's classical disagreements, or even something like gelatin, where people, modern scholars disagree. There's a disagreement between how Israel considers gelatin made from animal parts and America disagrees with it. The debate around lab-grown meat is not settled, not because fundamentally there's disagreement, but because it's so cutting edge. The methods for creating lab-grown meat are still being advised, to the point where about 2 months ago, there was literally another major stride forward in how lab-grown meat was made, and the chief rabbi of Israel, came out with a new ruling on it. And with rare exception, there hasn't been a conclusive ruling on how we should see lab-grown meat. And again, part of it is it's cutting edge, but the other part is, much like Coca-Cola, it is a very exciting industry with a lot of potential money to be made and some other great benefits we'll talk about. And a lot of companies are being secretive about how they prepare it. So the exception of one rabbi in Israel, Rav Asher Weiss, who's a very brilliant and sensitive rabbi, who was specifically asked by one company to rule for them, we don't really know exactly the processes that are being used. So what we're going to do tonight is look at the relevant sources, because one says, oh, it's so cutting edge, so Jewish law hasn't caught up. Jewish law has the sources that can be used to apply to lab-grown meat once we decide how to actually grow it. Once the companies reveal their secrets, Jewish law has all the tools in the areas of kashrut to decide how we look at it. Is it par of dairy, et cetera, like that. But until that time, all we can do is talk about what are the possibilities, and then we will look at some of the more recent rulings, and we'll be understand them. We'll look at an article from an Israeli newspaper, Israel Hayom, and it'll make a lot more sense after we've gone through these sources. So before we even get into anything on this page, I just want to mention some of the amazing benefits of lab-grown meat. So as opposed to regular meat, and by the way, when we say meat here, it can be any animal. And it can apply to even non-kosher animals. It can be lab-grown pig, lab-grown zebra. But we're going to limit ourselves for this conversation to one of the most popular meats on the planet, which is beef. I think chicken might, by volume, be more consumed, but we'll stick to hamburger meat, which also happens to be kosher. So whereas lab-grown meat is grown in a lab, traditional cows are obviously, they're raised. So it takes up a lot of land, requires an insane amount of water. They also produce a great amount of pollution. And to make a living cow, a beautiful Bessie, you want to pet and name her and everything like that, to your plate, they have to be killed. So the environmental factors, the cost factors, and certainly the ethical factors would all be obviated, made better by lab-grown meat. So how do you make lab-grown meat? The most basic thing is you take a cell, a very, very tiny part of a cow, or really any animal, you bring it into a lab and use a chemical solution, and I am not expert enough in chemistry to define that solution. You could easily find a YouTube video that'll go more into it, but basically a chemical solution, which is not food. There's not really a kashrut issue there, and it would basically grow the meat from scratch without having to slaughter the cow, without having to feed the cow for it to grow. It would grow in the solution. Now, as of 10 years ago, to grow a burger, it cost tens of thousands of dollars. Obviously, it is much, much cheaper now as the technology advances, and we'll get to the point where it will be far cheaper to just take a single cell from a cow. And by the way, you could have one single cow that lives the high life that could make billions, if not trillions, of hamburgers from it. So again, the ethical implications are beautiful, absolutely wonderful. So now knowing why lab-grown meat is awesome, and I fully support it. And by the way, when we talk about the kashrut issues, it's not that they're so difficult. The specific question we're going to ask tonight is, if a hamburger is grown from a cell of a cow, do we see it as meat? Hence the name of the class. Is lab-grown meat really meat? Because it's not like a regular cow walking around where you slaughter it. And then the question is, if it is meat, fine. But if it's not meat, could you eat cheese with it? So in order to understand that, we're going to explore the following questions here in the first box, and then we'll jump into our sources. So part of the conversation that the rabbis will explore is, what kind of cells are we taking? And by the way, this will be connected to the class on gelatin. If you weren't there, I'll mention how it connects. But are we taking, and I'll explain more of this later, embryonic cells? What part of the cow are we taking it from? So that makes a difference. 2, is the animal alive or dead? And if it's dead, has it been, for us as Jews, we care if it's been shechted when the cells from it are taken. 3, are there any added ingredients to it for flavor, taste, etc.? Those really aren't a big issue. That's just a question I can answer now. If they're added ingredients, as long as they're kosher, not a problem, but part of it. 4 is marit ayin. Marit ayin literally means what appears to the eye. And the reason that is important is, let's say you have a regular burger from a shechted cow in front of you. If I eat a piece of cheese on it, I'm breaking Jewish law. But if you have a lab-grown burger and we decide that it's not considered meat, but it looks, tastes, smells, feels like meat, and someone sees me eating cheese on it, even though it's technically not meat by Jewish law, people might think that it's okay to eat meat and dairy. So that's one of the considerations that rabbis are taking when they're ruling how we should look at meat. If it's called meat, then eating cheese with it, even if it's technically permitted, and we'll get to that later, would be a problem. So the 5th question is, can you eat it with real cheese? And then if you can, if we can consider it part of like a vegetable because it's created in a different way, should we? Or should we just consider it meat and make our lives easier for the sake of kashrut? So now we're going to jump into our sources. And as I said, the definitive answer hasn't been reached yet, but these are the sources that are being discussed that are relevant to the question of lab-grown meat. So the first one that everybody starts with is there any source in Jewish law that talks about meat being created in the non-typical way? A typical way is a cow and a bull they fall in love, they get married, they have a baby cow, that cow grows up, and then the shochet comes along and then shechs it, and then you make a hamburger out of it. So as long as the cow didn't have any injuries or blemishes, which is part of Jewish law, that's when we talk about glatt kosher, that even its lungs are glatt, smooth, there's no abrasions, any cancerous growths inside. It's a nice, healthy cow. It's shechted properly, then have all the hamburgers you want. But what if it was created in a non-natural way? So the first source that everyone talks to, and Shelley, I will go ahead and unmute you, is this famous Gemara. And there's another source that I'm not bringing here, but this kind of captures the essence of it. So go ahead, please, from Talmud Sanhedrin. The Gemara asks.
The Gemara asks, is there such a thing as meat that descends from heaven? Gemara answers, yes, it is like this incident. As Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta was walking along the way, he encountered those lions that were roaring at him, intending to eat him. He said, the young lions roar after their prey and seek their food from God, and they deserve to receive food. 2 thighs of an animal descended from heaven for him. The lions ate one of these thighs and they left the other one. He took it and entered the study hall and inquired about it. Is this thigh a kosher item or a non-kosher item? The sages said to him, certainly it is kosher, as a non-kosher item does not descend from heaven. In connection to that story, it is related that Rabbi Zeira asked Rabbi Abahu, if the likeness of a donkey had descended for him, what would the halacha have been? Would it have been permitted? Rabbi Abahu said to him, foolish bird, the sages already said to him that a non-kosher item does not descend from heaven. Therefore, it must be kosher.
Excellent. So this obviously gets into supernatural. It's an agadah, it's a tale, whether or not it happened. But the important takeaway, or the way that it's applied to this conversation, particularly the part about the donkey, is that any food in this context that's made in an unnatural way is kind of outside of the typical laws of kashrut from the Torah. In the Torah, certain animals are kosher, certain animals are not. But the animals that are created in this non-natural, miraculous way, and that word nes, miracle, comes up in many of the later discussions. If it's made in a truly miraculous, supernatural way, then it is automatically kosher, to the point where a donkey, which is not a kosher animal, is kosher. Now, it doesn't say here, which is an important question for us about the cheeseburger, if because it looks and tastes like an animal, do we consider it meat, or is it a separate category altogether? But many rabbis rule that if meat is made in a non-typical, non-natural way, then we certainly consider it kosher, and it's outside of the regular rules of kashrut, which means that we probably wouldn't consider it meat, and you could eat it with dairy. And a contemporary rabbi, I believe he's actually in Los Angeles, wrote in an article. So there's actually a journal in Israel called Tchumim, and it is the cutting edge contemporary rulings on Jewish law, like up to like the most exciting stuff that's happening in the world of Jewish law is happening in the pages of Tchumim. Like in issue 34 has Rav Tzvi Reisman's opinion. The rejection and an argumentation on it is in issue 35, and a rejection and rebuttal of that is issue 36. So it's really like the cutting edge. Now it's only available in Hebrew. There's a few old issues in English, but he wrote in the pages of Tchumim. And Elizabeth, I will go ahead and unmute you. And this is him talking about miraculous meats, and he talks about stem cells, which will come back to how much it matters what cells the meat's made from. Please.
Stem cell meat created in a lab is not miraculous. However, it is certainly not meat produced in the conventional way in which all animals were created. This is a new reality of a creation, which came about through human intervention and should be compared to meat created through Sefer Yetzirah. This would therefore be another reason to permit consumption of cloned meat, even if the original cell was taken from a non-kosher animal.
Excellent. So he makes an important distinction that'll come up in a moment, which is, we know how this happens. This is not through magic. This is not through the Kabbalistic mystical book, Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, which you can read. It's in translation. We know it's through science, but it's outside of the regular, typical order of nature, and therefore we can liken it to the case in the Gemara, and say that it's certainly kosher, and it probably is not in the same categories, meaning if you could lab grow a pig, he might even consider it kosher because it's outside of that. And before we come back to a rebuttal of that, so that's an argument that supports the Gemara, is meat made in the non-natural way, certainly going to be kosher, and probably would not be considered meat in the regular way. Now, this is a semi-rebuttal to that, which isn't to argue that it's not kosher, but that maybe we shouldn't think of it as meat. So Jane, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And this is a much older source from the 19th century, and it's a compilation of Jewish rulings on the Pirchei Tshuva. And he brings up a wild story, a midrash, about Yosef and his brothers. So go ahead, please, source number 3.
In the Shelah, Isaiah Horovitz, 16th to 17th century Prague, he wrote that a beast that was created by the book of creation, like we find in the Gemara, where they created a young heifer every Shabbat Eve, is permitted to eat when it's still alive. And this indeed happened with the tribes when Joseph cast aspersions on them to his father that they ate from a living animal, because Joseph thought it was an actual animal, and you should look into it. And it appears that in any case it is forbidden to eat from such an animal without rabbinic slaughter because of Marit Ayin.
Which is, again, appearances. So this is relevant in a couple of ways. One, if it's, so they're talking, so he says if it's miraculous meat, we can treat it as, we should be able to treat it as parov. And this says, no, if it looks like meat, you should really treat it as, meat. But the relevant, and the other thing here is, this source explicitly mentions from this midrash that the Torah forbids from the time of Noah, not just for Jews, but for all human beings. We can't just go up to an animal, kosher or not, and just rip off a piece of its flesh the way a lion would. That's forbidden by the Torah. But he points out here, technically speaking, an animal created in non-typical means is basically free from all the rules of the Torah, including meat and milk together, the laws of not eating flesh from a living animal. Technically, but we shouldn't do that anyways, because people will get the wrong idea and they might eat a regular burger with cheese and break one of the laws of the Torah. So even if we go by what Rav Reisman says, we still shouldn't do it in practice. However, all of this is generally rejected in the pages of Tchumim, the next volume, which is that and Rav Reisman kind of recognizes too, it's not at all miraculous. There's nothing miraculous about this process. It's a purely scientific process. And even though it's new and it's exciting and cutting edge, at the end of the day, just like a bull and a cow mate together and create a cow, so too, we know how to grow life. We know how to grow cells, just like we know how babies of different species grow. So it is a purely scientific process. We are simply doing it in a slightly different variation in a petri dish instead of inside of an actual cow. There's nothing miraculous about it. And why does that matter? That means it should still hold by all the laws of the Torah. We have done no magic, nothing mystical. This still is within the world that we know of nature. So the laws of the Torah apply, which is meat, and you can't eat the flesh off of a living animal. Now, why that becomes important, as we'll see later, is if you want to eat anything that comes from a kosher animal, what do you need to do to it first, Jane, before you eat a piece of a kosher animal? You need to?
You need to salt it and soak it, and
Well, before you get to that, you need to
slaughter it correctly.
You need to shecht it. But
Yeah.
if I go, so if I have, and this is, it'll say it later, or I don't know if it'll say it later, but we'll take this not for granted. If somebody shechts a kosher cow, if somebody shechts a cow, and then they take cells from that kosher shechted cow and grow meat from it and treat it as meat, nobody has a problem with that. And they say they treat it as meat, don't have a cheese. Everyone agrees that that is fine. The question is, can you take it from a living cow? And can you consider it not meat? But everybody's fine with the idea. Like, no one disagrees that you could, everyone would permit that if it's a kosher shechted cow, you could take the cells and do anything you want with it. So even though some would argue that this is beyond all the laws of kashrut, we can call it vegetables. It doesn't matter if it's alive or dead. We could even eat pig. That's rejected. But it's a really interesting argument based on this source in the Gemara and a few other ones. But again, because we know exactly what's happening and it is according to the laws of our nature that we understand that we don't apply this weird magic to it. We apply regular laws of kashrut. So before we go on, questions up until now? Excellent. So the next section here we call meat begets meat. And that's basically the rejection idea of it, which is that if you take a cell from a cow, it would still be considered a cow without question. It's still, if you take a cell from meat, it's still meat, meaning if you took a cell from pig, it would still be considered pig. So Susan, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And this is, again, all of these conversations, these cutting edge conversations today are all starting from the Talmud. So this is the source where the idea that anything you take from a cow should be treated as if it was still, cow meat. So go ahead, please, Susan, source number 1 from Chulin. Rabbi Yochanan says.
Rabbi Yochanan says, you shall not eat the life with the flesh. Dvarim 12:23. This is the source for the prohibition of eating a limb from a living animal. And the verse, and you shall not eat any flesh that is torn in the field, Shemot 22:30. This is the source for the prohibition of eating flesh severed from the living and flesh severed from a treifa, even if it is not an entire limb. And Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, you shall not eat the life with the flesh. This is the source of the prohibition of eating a limb from a living animal and of eating flesh severed from the living. And the verse, and you shall not eat any flesh that is torn in the field. This is the source of the prohibition of eating flesh severed from a treifa.
Thank you. So I kind of already discussed this already, but again, the idea that it's forbidden in the Torah for all people, not just Jews, to eat the flesh from a living animal, it has to be slaughtered first. So this is where they're discussing it then. Now, which means that you would have to shecht the cow first. And again, the reason that's important is not just how lab-grown meat is made, which is often from a living animal. And the reason that's important is that if you take it from a living cow, not only are the ethical questions, easier there for a vegetarian, might even be okay with that and be curious. There are a number of vegetarians. I myself was a vegetarian for 7 years. And even though I'm not anymore, the idea of eating a burger where a cow didn't have to die is very, very, attractive to me. I think that's a beautiful idea. But this source would argue that no, if it is taken from a living animal, it is still considered ripping off flesh, even if it's microscopic from a living animal. And the source that we have for that is, you could think, well, it's so microscopic. It's so tiny. How could it even be considered significant? And the Mishnah Torah and the rabbis who write these articles bring up an interesting point. If somebody goes to a cow and without slaughtering it, takes off an entire piece of meat, like a side of the beef, and eats it like a wild animal in the field, not only is that forbidden, but there would be a punishment for it, whether it would be lashes, etc., like that. But the rabbis say that if somebody eats a super, super, super tiny amount, they're not going to get punished because it's microscopic. However, just because there's no punishment, and Gloria, I know you are busy, but I think for the short source, I can unmute you. This very, very short source number 2, even if it's you won't get punished for it, are you allowed to do even eat a microscopic? And go ahead, source number 2.
A half measure is forbidden by the Torah, though one is not punished for eating it.
So this part of the conversation would argue that even though it's microscopic, we're still not allowed to eat anything, no matter how tiny, that comes from a living animal. So again, the whole idea of having one living cow where there's no ethical concerns, and also, if it's alive, it will keep growing. If you take even 1 billion cells from it or 1 trillion cells, the cow will probably be fine and regrow them at some point, muscle tissue, et cetera, like that. So one cow could really feed an entire nation. But the general understanding is no, even if it's super tiny, the cow would have to be shechted. Now, again, one shechted cow may not be able to have trillions upon trillions upon trillions, but it could get a lot in there. If Jews ruled that you could only grow lab-grown meat from a shechted cow, it could still change the world without question. And while a vegetarian may choose to not eat from that, it's still far, far better than the number of cows that we need to slaughter now to get the amount of meat we need. And then one more source in this section will also argue against the whole, if it's supernatural, it's outside the laws of nature. And that's the whole point of this section. We're still holding by the typical laws of kashrut, even though this is incredible science. So again, if any of you figured out how to read the book of Yetzirah of creation and make a magical cow on Erev Shabbos, and a pig comes down, you have my permission to eat it if it's really magic. But that is not what we're doing here. So the whole thing about a donkey coming down and being kosher because it came through from Shemayim, sent down from heaven, does that apply? And this source in the Mishnah, and Gloria, why don't you read this again because it's so short, source number 3 from Mishnah Bechorot.
That which comes from an impure species is impure, and that which comes from a pure species is pure.
Excellent, because this animal is not made through this magical, miraculous from heaven means. It comes from an actual pig that we have here on earth. Anything that's taken from it would still be considered pig. So it doesn't matter that it's super duper microscopic. It is still a pig as the starter agent and would be unkosher. So lab-grown meat would not allow observant Jews to eat pork or bacon or anything like that. So before we go on, any questions up until now about, again, the point of this section was the rejection of seeing lab-grown meat as something truly outside of nature, which again, some rabbis made, but that's generally been rejected. And even though there's not a total consensus, yeah, Shelley, please.
So just in reference to what you said in the very beginning, when you talked about the animals, this is basically solidifying the fact that if they got a cell from a zebra, or that's the example you gave, so no matter what, it would
Correct.
not be. Okay, I just wanted to clarify.
Forming, and this is why this is such a cool, a cool topic to discuss, because there's no final consensus yet. The forming consensus generally follows what we just learned in the second section, which is that we don't rule by the miraculous thing of Sefer Yetzirah that it's outside the laws of nature and kashrut. The general rule is because we're doing it within the laws of science that we understand, it's within nature, and therefore, yes, we could never make a zebra kosher, whether it was shechted or not. The starting animal has to be kosher, and again, the forming consensus has to be shechted, which still, even though a vegetarian may not like that, most of the benefits, far and away, would still be there. So we're actually in a good place right now. If that's where we ended the conversation, that it just has to be a shechted animal, it has to be a kosher animal, that's fine. And for many, including, I think the conversation is still a lot to talk about. We have more sources. But again, if the conversation ended here, we're in a pretty good place. Lab-grown meat, all you have to do is make sure it's a kosher animal and it's shechted. And again, once the process is streamlined, we can create enough kosher burgers from one cow, 1 or 2 slaughtered cows, that could feed Jews. And especially because you can probably freeze the cells. You can keep them for a long time. We could probably use 1 slaughtered cow to feed Jews for 1,000 years. A scientist could probably clarify, no, it doesn't work that way, because this is another point we'll get to later. We're not taking these cells from any part of the cow. It's typically always, I read the word, but I didn't include it here. It's some word I didn't even know how to pronounce. We're usually taking it from the muscles. We're usually taking it from a specific part of the cow, but again, number by number of data points, this could still absolutely change the future of mankind and our relationship to meat, and making it healthier too, because most of the flavor of meat comes from fat, which is where a lot of the unhealthy stuff comes. But if we could get the protein from the muscle tissue that is grown and then recreate the flavor in a synthetic way with more healthy options, everybody's a winner. We get the protein, we get unlimited food, tastes delicious. Like when we perfect this, which we are close to doing, this is incredible. So again, if we stopped here, we'd be fine. And many rabbis prefer this ruling, which is shechted animal. And again, whether it's a cow or a chicken or a giraffe, anything like that, and it has to be shechted, and it's treated like meat. So that's a good place for us if we want it to end. But the story doesn't end right here, because there's another conversation that is happening right now, which is that when you start with this cell is insanely tiny. The human eye is incapable of seeing it, unless some of you have really, really good glasses. I'm looking at you, Elizabeth. So the question is, even though it comes from a cow, because it's too tiny to even see, does it have different rules? And the reality is that in certain halachic cases, many cases, if something is microscopically too small to see, we don't consider it anything. So could we apply it here? So Shelley, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. So this is 19th century Aruch HaShulchan, and he's just kind of stating a generally accepted halacha, and I'll mention a few places where it's actually quite relevant. Go ahead, please, from the Aruch HaShulchan, Rabbi Yechiel Epstein.
In my youth, I heard of one who witnessed many thousands of times all sorts of creatures in water through a microscope. And according to this, how is water permitted? The Torah did not forbid that which the eye cannot see, since the Torah was not given to angels.
Excellent. This is a very important halachic principle, mostly, perhaps almost entirely, in the area of kashrut. So here's a great example. I am checking my lettuce. I do check my lettuce for bugs. If I can see a bug, I rinse it off or rip off that piece. But there are probably bugs in there too small for my eye to see. Do I need to take out like one of those, diamond glass, microscopes or to see those? And the consensus is no, I do not. If it is too small for a human being to see with the naked eye, we consider it insignificant, and we are not breaking kashrut. It is not considered eating a treif forbidden bug by eating that microscopic bug. Now, any of you who might have heard of this, or you could look into it, I want to say somewhere in New York, where these microscopic animals do exist in the water, there are people who won't drink that water, and they have to have it filtered and stuff like that. But that's not consistent with the main consensus of Jewish law. So if something's too small for the eye to see, it doesn't exist. However, that's a case where we don't know it's there. We don't want it there. We don't care if it's there. If we are growing a lab-grown burger, do we care about the cell? Is it important to the process? Is it essential that we have it there? And Elizabeth, I'll have you take the next two short sources. So both of these sources are going to reject the idea that we can say because the cell is microscopic, we can consider it nothing. And now we revert to the whole idea that it's not meat. It doesn't abide by the laws of kashrut. We could even eat pig or zebra this way. No, because first source number 2, as quoted in the 16th century Shulchan Aruch, please, Elizabeth, Ramah.
Because something that is forbidden in itself and it gives form, even by 1,000 times the amount, it cannot be nullified.
Excellent. So this actually was relevant in the class we had on gelatin. Gelatin can be made from multiple sources, including fish or seaweed, but typically it's made from animal parts. Sometimes a kosher animal like cow, but they're not slaughtered. So the question is, because it's such a tiny amount of what gives gummy bears their substance, can we just pretend it's not there? Because there is a Jewish principle. If I'm cooking a meat soup and a drop of milk comes in, and there's 60 times more soup than the drop, it fell in accidentally, I can ignore that drop of milk and my soup is still kosher. But with gelatin, people will rule that you can't do that. Why? Because the gelatin is an essential ingredient. You don't get gummy bears without that gelatin made from the animal parts. Therefore, even if there's 1,000,000 times as much gummy bears as that drop of gelatin, and I don't think it's actually that much, because you couldn't have gelatin gummy bears without that drop, you can never pretend it's not there. So too, with lab-grown meat, you cannot grow lab meat unless you start with that cell. It doesn't matter if it's microscopic, it is essential, so it becomes as if we can see it. And the contemporary rabbi, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who I believe passed away in 2015, he lived in Israel, was a medical a genius, and he studied science as much as Jewish law. He brings another reason for rejecting this idea of considering cells insignificant. So go ahead, please, Elizabeth. Source number 3 from Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's Minchat Shlomo.
Since people are dealing with these particles and transferring them from one species to another, it is considered precisely as if they are visible to the naked eye.
Excellent. So here he's not necessarily talking about lab-grown meat, but he is talking about science in which there's genetic modification and coming from different animals, people, et cetera, like that. And people say, well, it shouldn't even count in Jewish law. It should be outside the bounds of Jewish law because they're insignificantly small. And his point is no, yes, their size is far too small for the human eye to see, but you can't say they're insignificant. They are so essential to everything you're doing, their essence to the process, it's as if they are visible. And I'll say that one more time. Even though they can't be seen because they're essential to the process, it's as if they can be seen, and it's treated as if you cut off a big chunk of cow meat. So the idea that because cells are so tiny, they're outside the regular laws of kashrut, that's out the window too. So we're back to where we were before this, which is it needs to be a kosher animal, and it needs to be shechted, and it's still considered meat of that animal. So that's where we're at now. So any questions on this section, which again is fascinating for the future of science and how we just consider things about microscopic, and generally we don't care unless we want it there, and it's intentionally there, not accidental. Any questions up until now? Oh yeah, Shelley, please. Got to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. So
No, not at all.
by what he's saying here, does that mean that it's considered flesh?
Yes.
Right. So it's actually considered.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No. I just wanted to say, it seems to me by what he's saying, it's as if it was visible and that it was a larger amount. Then you would have to consider it not parv, but you'd have to consider meat.
So when Rav Shlomo Zalman, and Jane, then I see your hand up. When Shlomo Zalman was alive, I don't know if lab-grown meat was even, I'm sure it was an idea, but I don't think it was really a thing. So he's not ruling on lab-grown meat. It says here, this is not a translation of his text, but the translation here mentions that the context of this ruling is in genetic modification. But the way that this is used in those articles in Techumin and other rabbis is that they're using him as a source to say that the cell retains its identity because it's essential to the process. So it would be used to argue that, yes, it is still flesh. If it comes from a part of the animal that is flesh, and I'm going to say that again because anyone here in my gelatin class might start getting some ideas. If it comes from a part of the animal that would be considered meat and flesh, then it will always retain that identity because it's an essential ingredient. So that's how it would be used, even though that's not what he was talking about here. So great question, Shelley. And then Jane, yes, please. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
I was going to say the same thing, but it seems to me that all 3 sections, A, B, and C, are all saying that no matter how you consider it, it's going to be fleishik no matter how you, and it's not for vegetarians. It's good for the environment, but it's not for vegetarians.
So the consensus that we have up till this point, and kind of the consensus in the rabbinic world right now, is what you just said. Section A would argue differently. Section A would say it's not food as we think of it. It's outside the category of kashrut, which is why you could eat a donkey. And that's how Rav Tzvi Reis. So Rav Tzvi Reisman is a little bit in between because he talks about his meat being produced, but ultimately it's outside of the category. He says it here. Afilu, or I don't know how he does it in the Hebrew, velo al behemot shenivra'u mita'e geza be'am. Oh no, that's not where it is there. I'd have to look exactly where he's saying it there, but he does say somewhere in there, even if it's taken from a non-kosher animal, it would be fine. So that actually does say that it's basically like a vegetable. And we're going to come back to that idea because even though this is generally rejected, there's another way to get to vegetable status. So right now, the consensus is most will still agree that if you take it from a meaty part of the animal, it has to be shechted, it has to be a kosher animal. And it doesn't matter, it's microscopically insignificant. Now, there is one more argument that's still trying to save us and basically get back to section A and say, can we take this out of the normal area of kashrut? And Jane, I'll just leave you unmuted. So this ruling from the Khatam Sofer, Moshe Sofer, 19th century, it's him actually rejecting gelatin, but in his rejection of gelatin, he opens up a door for us towards cells. So go ahead, please, Jane, source number 1 here from the Khatam Sofer.
I am not able to find a permissive ruling because the skin was already dried out. And skin is a different case when it is still dehydrated, which is not our case where it becomes reconstituted by the liquid and we rule as if it has again become actual meat. And this is obvious in my humble opinion.
Excellent, thank you. So his argument is that with gelatin, what happens is you start with something from, and this would really be about like gelatin from a pig. Pig is forbidden to eat. What they do is they take the parts from a pig, which would be forbidden to eat, but then through an intense chemical process, they make it till it's not food anymore. Now, when it's not food, hypothetically, whatever powder they make, the Khatam Sofer might say, it's not food, but you could eat it. Like if you make a medicine capsule out of it, he'd probably be okay with that because it's not food anymore. But the way gelatin, and by the way, by medicine, that's fine, but the way gelatin is also used is to make Jell-O. So when you do that, you add it together with food ingredients and it returns to the status of being food. And he argues, and not everyone agrees, but many argue that it has returned to being food and therefore it's like pig food again and it's totally forbidden. The counter, or not the counter, but based on that argument, if you wanted to apply it to cells from a cow, again, with gelatin, it's food where it's forbidden, then it's not food where it's permitted, but it doesn't matter, it's not food anymore, and then it becomes food again. But with cells, what was it never in the first place? It was never what, Jane?
It was never food.
It was never food. It never had the status of food, so it never became forbidden in the first place. So it doesn't matter if again, those who argue, and I'm not bringing all the sources here, some of this is based on Shuvot I read, but some would argue that you created something, brand new. It was never in the category of food, so it never had the status of being permitted because it was a cell. However, again, this goes back to the previous section about it's an essential ingredient and it never loses its identity. Yes, it started as a microscopic cell, but what do you do with it? And Jane, I'll just have you take source number 1. This is a contemporary Israeli rabbi who's currently writing today. You could email him if you want. I'd email him in Hebrew if you really want him to respond. So Rav Yaakov Ariel, please, source number 2.
In my opinion, the entire discussion of nullification is not relevant to this matter. The forbidden substance itself is increasing, and anything which emerges from it is likewise forbidden. There is no nullification here in another substance.
Now, his technical language here is not talking about starting from something that's not food. He's talking about if it's so tiny and insignificant, can you consider it not there? But his explanation here, his reasoning is that you're starting with a substance and all you're doing is increasing the size of that substance, which means the essential identity of it never goes away. It actually becomes more of what it is. So you can't say that it wasn't food to begin with. It was just a very, very, very tiny version of food that's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and becoming, because what is life other than just the proliferation of cells? Yes, my body's made of different things, but fundamentally, every single tiny part of me is still me. So too, even though you could say, I can't go to the store and eat a cell, a lab-grown burger is still fundamentally just billions of little cells. And fundamentally, that individual starting cell still is meat. It starts as meat and all it does is grow more and more and more. So he rejects that idea that you could say, well, it was never food to begin with. He said, all it is tiny, tiny, tiny food. And I'm oversimplifying his argument a little bit, but this is how many understand Rav Yaakov Ariel, is that he's essentially saying that if you start with a cell of an animal, doesn't matter how tiny it is, it's still fundamentally just a super, super tiny burger or a muscle cell in most of our cases. Before we go on to the next section, any questions up until now?
I have a little bit of a problem that you have to kill the whole animal to get the cells.
Yes.
It seems cruel to me.
It's definitely one of the challenges, but again, talking about scale, like for example, when people talk about the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, And they're troubled by the idea of animal sacrifice, the number of sacrifices, even if we had as many Jews today, to the amount of meat that we slaughter so McDonald's can serve over 1 billion burgers is very, very different. So I fully validate a vegetarian being uncomfortable with the idea of animal sacrifices. But again, in terms of the number of animals actually being killed to serve God versus the number of burgers so we can, or chicken so we can have chicken wings, whatever, it's vastly different. And again, in this case, it's even far more vastly, astronomically different. And that one cow could again feed, again, we could probably look up the actual numbers. Someone could, if anyone wants to Google right now, how many lab-grown burgers could be made from one cow. I don't know if they would make a differentiation between live or dead, but I'd be very curious. If it's alive, hypothetically, it's infinite. If someone can Google how many can be grown from a dead cow, I'd be curious what the number is. Because if the number is 10, then that's very depressing. But I imagine it's an astronomically large number. But our entire conversation now and the principles that we've laid down are still relevant to the ongoing conversation, except every single lab-grown burger that has been made up until quite recently have all been taken from the same general parts of the animal, which are muscle cells, meaning that, you know, if you learn about how babies born, all babies start from the most fundamental basic cells, and then they divide and conquer, as it were, and they develop into different cells, eye cells, eyelash cells, nose cells, finger cells. Well, I'm talking about a human now, but the lab-grown burgers that have been made for years have all been made from muscle meat. And that's key there, that phrase again, muscle meat. Muscle is a part of an animal that is considered animal parts. It's animal flesh and meat. And there, whenever it is taken from muscles, the consensus is, if you take it from, again, a cow or any kosher animal from the muscle or an essential part of its meat, the stuff that we would actually eat, then it has to be shechted, and it has to be a kosher animal, and it would still be considered meat. But what if you take it from a different part? What if you take it from the feather of a chicken or the eyelash of a chicken? If I went up, again, I don't know why I would do this, but I believe if I went up to, do chickens have eyelashes? Cows have eyelashes. If I went up to a cow and I plucked one of its eyelashes, if I am wrong, I will put on this class, I will correct myself. But I believe that if I just plucked a cow's eyelash and ate it, I'd be a jerk and I would never do that. But I don't think that would be an issue. I don't think I would have to, shecht the animal for that, because it's not considered, meat. It's not something that would be beholden to the general laws of kashrut. And by the way, we know this from the laws of gelatin, because the rabbis say that gelatin is made from the parts of an animal which are generally not considered meat, their feet, and typically they're outside of the general, or they're different from the typical laws of meat and dairy and flesh and everything like that. So what if you are able to make chicken, lab-grown chicken, from a chicken's feather? A chicken walks along the ground and a feather falls off. Again, it would be horrible, but I could pick it up and eat it, and I don't believe I would be breaking any laws of kashrut. I don't think I would enjoy it, but what if you could do that? Would that change the category? And what has happened literally in the last probably 2 or 3 years is now scientists have the capacity to make lab-grown meat, not from muscle tissue, but from pre-embryonic cells, meaning before it even starts growing to what we would be considered the most basic version of a cow. These are cells that are before their cow. They technically come from a cow embryo that's either inside of a cow or something like that, and they are cells that you're getting from a cow, but they haven't even started to develop into cow yet. Now you could ask the question, why then do we even need a cow? That's beyond my scientific understanding. And if anyone here is the biological kin to explain why we even need to start with that, but that's where science is going right now. You can take cells from a cow that aren't specifically muscle cells. Again, I'll make a distinction. If you go up to a cow and you cut off a tiny piece of their muscle, all the laws of kashrut apply. It has to be shechted, it's meat, it has to be a kosher animal. But if you're able to take a cow hair or a cow eyelash or a chicken feather, or in this case specifically, a pre-embryonic cell, the conversation changes. And that led to this article, which is, I believe, from 2022. And it's also part of a ruling from the chief rabbi of Israel that came out in January of this year. So I will go ahead and read this short section. I think this is from Israel Hayom. Rabbis have rules that lab-grown meat produced from non-meat cells is not considered meat and therefore can be consumed with dairy. Boom, boom. We could end right there, and that's the point there. Everything we've done up till this point is based on the science up until a few years ago, which is they needed to take it from muscle tissue and then just keep it growing in a solution. But now they're at the point where they can take other cells from any animal and do what you want with it. And by the way, this does, I believe, Jane, you had made the point, I think this does open the door to taking zebra, or maybe Shelley had made it, you could take zebra hair potentially, because if it's not specifically a zebra cell, it's just a preembryonic basic universal cell, who's to say it's a zebra? So it continues, the ruling published this weekend, so again, this is a year ago, really not that long ago, was signed by rabbis of Israel's dairy giant Tenuva. So there's some business components behind this too. It's in their benefit to say that you could have cheeseburgers. Rabbi Zev Whitman and the head of Tzohar Rabbinical Organizations, Kashrut Branch, Rabbi Oren Duvdevani, as well as Rabbi David Stav, Rabbi Yoel Churlo, Rabbi Aaron Katz, Rabbi Moshe Begel, and others, all of whom agreed that the new method, and that's the key, new method of producing meat, different from everything we've talked about this entire class, altered the final product's kashrut status. And the chief rabbi of Israel, his recent ruling of January, you can find it on Jerusalem Post and other places online, essentially is based on this argument, which is with the new science, it's no longer considered meat. And the next part of the conversation is our questions about, so it's not meat, but it looks and tastes like meat, so should we treat it like meat? And the chief rabbi of Israel said, if it's marketed as a veggie burger, even though it's taken from a cow's cell, and it tastes, looks, and has the health benefits of cow meat, if you call it a veggie burger, or you call it a lab burger or something clever so it's delicious, but you don't say it's actual meat, you could have a cheeseburger. So just like we have Beyond Burger, which is actually made from plants, and of course you could have a cheeseburger because no one says it's meat, so too, this new method where you're taking cells from a cow or from a pig, if you call it not an animal, it's like that argument about, do you call oat milk milk? There's a whole industry thing there, and they're suing each other. Don't call it milk if it's not from cows. But if you don't call it meat, you call it cell-based burgers, which again, we'll see how that would sell, like having green ketchup. But if you call it cell-based burgers, you can treat it like totally parov. So we'll go on. At the beginning, the process of producing meat in this way was based on cells taken from live animals. The rabbis wrote in a position paper, the greatest rabbinical authorities were divided about whether the process and the cloning of cells voided their halachic status as meat. Again, that's the whole thing. Do they lose? Are they still meat because they started from a cow? And about whether they must be banned or not, or considered meat. We will not rule in that matter, the paper read. So that question about whether they're alive or not, we're not ruling on that. In recent years, new methods have been developed to produce meat in laboratories based on cells that are not meat. In one, cells are taken from pre-embryonic cells in a fertilized egg. So it hasn't even gone into the cow, the mother cow yet to start growing. It's like the very beginning of the process before it. In another, pre-embryonic cells are taken from a cow, but it's still, undifferentiated cells that, again, are universal, and you can't even really call it a cow at that point. According to the rabbis, Jewish law states that the status, and this is the cool thing, where do they get this? From Jewish law. The status of a fertilized chicken egg is kosher, but neither meat nor milk. So a chicken we consider meat, but in an egg where it hasn't grown into a chicken yet, it's been fertilized, but it's not a chicken yet, we consider it parov. That's their source text. That's so cool that classical Jewish law is still relevant to this crazy cutting edge science. Therefore, they rule, okay, parov, neither meat nor dairy, even if the cells are identical to fat or muscle cells from an animal raised naturally. So that's the thing. If you look at them, in this fertilized egg, they're the same cells you'll get from a fully grown cow. But because of the technical part they are in the process, we don't consider them that. Despite the end product's external similarity to meat products, essentially from a molecular level, they're the same. It is no different in essence to the plant-based meat substitutes on the market. Therefore, it may be cooked and eaten along with dairy products without creating the mistaken impression that meat and dairy are being consumed together. Paper concluded, and this is so cool. Now we have two very relevant rulings. If you want to take cells from an actual cow, this paper says we're not sure about that. The consensus that I've seen is generally it has to be shechted and it has to be a kosher animal. Now, with this paper here, it seems like they're not really opening the door to non-kosher animals. It looks like they're still limited this to kosher animals, but you don't have to worry, for Jane, as you said, you don't have to worry if it's alive or dead, because it hasn't even started growing into life yet. You take it from a fertilized egg before it started growing. So now you've gotten the issue of you don't have to slaughter an animal anymore. And B, the whole environmental impact of having to raise all these cows and the pollution they produce, that's all gone. All of that's gone. Now, the question about, is there a way to eat lab-grown meat from unkosher animals? It doesn't seem like that's where we're at yet. But the other thing, the big question we started out with is, can these lab-grown burgers be eaten with cheese? And this is where we have three different important points. If it's taken from a shechted kosher animal that was alive and it's taken from the muscle meat that is developed into actual muscle mass, no, it's fully 100% meat. It's kosher, and it would still help the environment greatly. And it's not ideal because you still have to slaughter the animal. But again, if they find out that of all these processes, the only one that's makes any sense financially, practically, is to slaughter an animal, or for those who don't keep kosher, to take it from a living animal's muscle tissue, if that's the best we get for it, not bad at all. But the second thing is, if they can make it viable to take it from a fertilized egg, then that fixes all of our issues, and it's not considered meat. However, this is what I mentioned before. The chief rabbi of Israel absolutely supported that ruling, but made an important point on top of it, which is it has to be marketed as not being meat. It has to be marked, again, whether you call it cell-based or lab burgers or something more clever. If you call it meat, because of the issue of marit ayin and not wanting to confuse people and mess up Jewish law, which is really important. There are things that we rule, and even if they're technically permitted, if they look problematic, we rule they're forbidden. The chief rabbi of Israel, who, by the way, is not the end-all be-all, but his ruling makes a lot of sense, and I very much validate his logic. He says, if you just say it's a regular hamburger, but it's technically not, that's confusing. But if you market it as saying this is a pre-embryonic burger, so at Shul de Shabbos we're serving pre-embryonic burgers, then our vegetarians can eat it, we could have cheese on it and everything like that, the chief rabbi of Israel would say, go for it. But again, this is so cutting edge, and even in the less ideal of these three situations, it still could absolutely change the world for the better. And even if a vegetarian wouldn't eat one of those shechted cow lab-grown burgers, many of the vegetarians who, from the ethical concern, want to limit the slaughtering of animals and save the world, everybody's kind of a winner. May not be perfect, but with this pre-embryonic ruling by the rabbis, for an observant vegetarian, it opens up the entire world. It could literally save the world. It's one of the coolest things ever, and the Jewish laws are just catching up to it. Now, what we really need, though, is a company to make it financially and practically viable. And then you go to the OU, and the OU reads this article or reads these sources, and they make their ruling, and they decide, is it meat, dairy, or para? So that's the next step, is for it to become financially viable, practically viable. And then the third thing that I know they've gotten better is delicious. Because a number of years ago, they made one of these lab-grown burgers, and where does the taste come from in most burgers? Not from the muscle, it comes from the fat. And a lab-grown burger doesn't have the experience of eating food and getting fat and delicious and juicy. They have to recreate that. And what's funny is with the Beyond Burgers, which are totally plant-based, even though they're better in general for the environment, they're not necessarily healthier, because to recreate the taste, they shove in lots of salt and other things like that could be just as unhealthy as a real burger. So there's a lot of work we have to do before we perfect this, but it's coming. And the fact that, again, literally 2 months ago, the chief rabbi of Israel came out with a new variation on the ruling means that this is happening, people. And we will all, please God, live to see the day when we go to the store and we see an OU or a Star K or a Chaf K. And I'm very curious to see if it has a D for dairy, M for meat, or nothing, and it's totally parv.